I've entitled my thoughts for today, Freedom and Privilege, and we'll be looking at 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verses 1 to 13. As we begin, I want to ask you a question. Do you consider yourself to be privileged or underprivileged? The war in Ukraine has made me increasingly conscious of the privilege into which I was born. I've never been forced to flee the country of my birth. I've never wondered if there would be a roof over my head or if I would go hungry. Quite to the contrary, I was privileged to be born into the wonderful country of Canada. And I was privileged to be born into a family that was wealthier than some others. Honest reflection tells me that I have enjoyed numerous privileges which have given me options throughout life that less privileged people don't have. Like many other aspects of life, privilege feels relative, and we are tempted to lament that others have more privilege than we. There is no doubt, though, that compared to refugees fleeing war, all of us here in Canada enjoy significant privilege. Privileges, we could say, are those benefits which allow us to make choices we would not otherwise have the luxury of making. We tend to assume that the privileges we enjoy are good and produce positive results, but that's not necessarily true. Privilege sometimes allows people to avoid responsibility. Worse, it's easy for the privileged to mistreat the underprivileged. At its extreme, one person's claim to privilege can enslave another. Something I think we've seen in recent times is that people tend to confuse privilege and freedom. People will claim that they are fighting for their freedoms when really they are fighting to maintain their privileges. We get it. None of us like to give up privileges after they are once enjoyed. But are privileges and freedom really the same thing? Not according to the scripture text we look at today. Last week, we considered Psalm 95, which took us all the way back to the time when the nation of Israel, escaping from Egypt, complained to Moses that they didn't have water. We recall that magnificent account where Moses struck the rock at Horeb, causing it to erupt with life-saving water. The powerful warning of Psalm 95 is for us to not harden our hearts toward God when facing uncertainty, as did the nation of Israel in the desert. As I mentioned last week, 1 Corinthians 10, verse 4, used the life-saving water from the rock as a metaphor for Jesus. Because of that connection, we're going to take a closer look today at 1 Corinthians 10, which examines the impact of misusing privilege. I have to warn you that 1 Corinthians 10 is not a comfortable passage, but verse 6 advises us that this is a critical, cautionary tale to which we should pay careful attention. As we read 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verses 1 to 13, take note of the numerous privileges the people enjoyed along with the abuse of that privilege. This is what it says in 1 Corinthians chapter 10. For I do not want you to be ignorant of the fact, brothers and sisters, that our ancestors were all under the cloud and that they all passed through the sea. Now take note of the privileges. They were all baptized into Moses in the cloud and in the sea. They all ate the same spiritual food and drank the same spiritual drink. For they drank from the spiritual rock that accompanied them, and that rock was Christ. Look what happened despite the privileges. Nevertheless, God was not pleased with most of them. Their bodies were scattered in the wilderness. Why? Well, here's the advisement about the cautionary tale. Now, these things occurred as examples to keep us from setting our hearts on evil things as they did. Do not be idolaters, as some of them were. As it is written, the people sat down to eat and drink and got up to indulge in revelry. We should not commit sexual immorality, as some of them did. And in one day, 23,000 of them died. We should not test Christ, as some of them did and were killed by snakes. And do not grumble, as some of them did and were killed by the destroying angels. All these things happened to them as examples and were written down as warnings for us, on whom the culmination of the ages has come. So if you think you are standing firm, be careful that you don't fall. No temptation has overtaken you, except what is common to mankind. And God is faithful. He will not let you be tempted beyond what you can bear, but when you are tempted, He will also provide a way out so that you can endure it. An interesting feature of this reading is that it uses the rescue of the nation of Israel out of Egypt as a graphic depiction of how God's salvation works through Christ. Here in 1 Corinthians chapter 10, passing through the Red Sea becomes reminiscent of a salvation experience, which is likened to a baptism. Central to the lesson in this passage is the fact that their salvation granted the nation of Israel significant privileges. They enjoyed supernatural guidance. They benefited from a miraculous rescue. They were supplied with food for which they didn't have to work. And they drank life-giving water from the rock. We would expect that those privileges should guarantee a positive outcome for the nation of Israel. After all, no other nation was ever showered with those types of privileges. In a parallel to what we saw last week in Psalm 95, after a promising opening, 1 Corinthians 10 takes a dark turn at verse 5, where it says, "Nevertheless, God was not pleased with most of them. Their bodies were scattered in the wilderness." We should not fail to notice that present privilege is no guarantee of future blessing. Despite their massive privileges, the Israelite people gave in to their cravings for evil and became idolaters. The reference about indulging in revelry recalls the despicable episode of the golden calf that's found in Exodus chapter 32. The mention of 23,000 dying because of sexual immorality is an allusion to the sordid interaction with foreign Moabite women, as recorded in Numbers 25. In addition, there was endless grumbling to the point that God allowed venomous snakes to attack the people, which is detailed in Numbers chapter 21. That incident ended with the famous bronze serpent on a pole. The failure of the people under the leadership of Moses to turn their privilege into successful living resulted in the admonitions which 1 Corinthians 10 states in both verses 6 and 11, that we should pay close attention to their bad example. The people who had fled Egypt failed to understand that it's a serious mistake to equate privilege with freedom. Privilege can get us in trouble as easily as it can benefit us, which is why verse 12 has this warning. So if you think you are standing firm, be careful that you don't fall. As much as we want to equate privilege with freedom, privilege alone cannot guarantee us freedom. If it could, we wouldn't read about the scandal-plagued lives of the rich and famous. So if privilege doesn't guarantee freedom, what will? The most well-known verse of 1 Corinthians 10, I think, offers us some clues. Verse 13 famously tells us, "No temptation has overtaken you except what is common to mankind, and God is faithful. He will not let you be tempted beyond what you can bear. But when you are tempted, he will also provide a way out so that you can endure it." The word that is translated temptation and in the verb form as being tempted has at its core meaning the idea of testing. We are meant to understand that temptations are tests about the choices we make in life. The Israelites in the desert got in trouble because of their history of making poor choices. Despite their great privileges, the people still made bad choices. They proved that privilege will never insulate us from making the wrong choice. On the other hand, even the most underprivileged can still make the right choice. When it comes to freedom, then, freedom is the end result of making the right choice. Freedom, we could say, is claiming the privilege of making the right choice. Understood this way, 1 Corinthians 10:13 promises that wisdom is always available to make the right choice, even when that choice becomes very difficult. We don't live long before we understand that making the right life choices can be challenging. At the same time, there are few things in life more liberating than being able to look back, knowing that we made the right choice. 1 Corinthians chapter 10 is much longer than the 13 verses we have read to this point. And while we don't have time to look at the whole chapter, you should know that all of 1 Corinthians 10 is a study in making liberating choices. In verses 23 to 24, Paul gave the following guidance about freedom and making choices. This is what he said: "I have the right to do anything you say, but not everything is beneficial. I have the right to do anything, but not everything is constructive. No one should seek their own good, but the good of others." These instructions highlight a common error people make in pursuing freedom. Genuine freedom is never about personal gain, but about the good of the community. Notice the key word, constructive, which brings to mind the idea that genuine freedom builds up those around us. Too often we see that one person's pursuit of freedom disrupts the well-being of the larger community. To this end, near Paul's conclusion to this chapter, he wrote, "So whether you eat or drink or whatever you do it all for the glory of God. Do not cause anyone to stumble, whether Jews, Greeks, or the church of God." And that's in verses 31 to 32 of 1 Corinthians 10. 1 Corinthians 10 calls us to be very careful in our pursuit of freedom. It's about the choices we make. We can choose to protect our privileges, or we can choose what's constructive for people around us. Experiencing long-term freedom is about making the right choices.